Morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is my first attempt at a VBB narrated PowerPoint, so bear with me. Try to keep awake. If you can't sleep at night, you're welcome to use my slides. I give you permission, but I'll try my best to alter my voice up and down and so on. But welcome. The consumer's right to terminate a credit agreement prematurely. Study themes 11 and 12 in your study guide. By means of an introduction, credit agreements, like all other contracts, may be terminated in various ways. The most common means of termination is performance by both parties. The NCA does create the right for both parties to terminate the credit agreement prematurely. However, the credit provider can only terminate prematurely where the consumer is in breach of contract, for instance, by making use of a lex commissoria in the contract, if any, to cancel the agreement. This concerns debt enforcement in court, which we will do under study theme 13 soon. But what is the relevance of the question whether or not a consumer should be allowed to prematurely terminate a credit agreement? Interest and other credit costs are calculated over the duration of a credit agreement. That is the reason why you will pay thousands in interest and other costs where, for instance, a mortgage is involved, because these credit agreements are usually concluded for long periods of 20 to 30 years. Premature termination by the consumer, therefore, has an influence on the credit provider's total earnings or profit. You must remember that one of the main aims of the NCA is to protect the consumer. It is therefore unsurprising that the NCA affords the consumer the opportunity to terminate a credit agreement prematurely. Prematurely means that if the credit contract is, for instance, concluded for a 4-year term, the consumer can terminate the contract before the 4 years have expired. The NCA's premature termination rights are the right to rescind or cool off, the right to settle a credit agreement, the right to surrender the goods, and lastly, advance or early payments without settling the debt. We will now consider these rights in detail. You must know each of them and be able to compare and distinguish them. You must also be able to advise a client when to use which termination right in order to achieve a particular outcome. The latter can only be achieved if you know the advantages and disadvantages of each of these rights. Next, the cooling off right. The right to rescind a credit agreement or the cooling off right is one and the same thing. So it's called the right of rescission or the cooling off right. Study theme 11, Nagel Business Law, paragraph 1409. It is a basic principle of our law of contract that a person who has entered into a contract may not unilaterally terminate the contract because she wishes to do so. She needs a good reason for such a drastic step, such as material breach of contract by the consumer. Consumer credit legislation has changed this time-honored principle, but only to a limited extent and also only in respect to credit agreements that are subject to the particular legislation. It is common in consumer legislation worldwide to afford a consumer a cooling off period during which she may reconsider the contract and cancel it, without having to advance a reason and without being guilty of breach of contract. The same holds for South African consumer credit legislation, such as the National Credit Act, the Consumer Protection Act, and the Alienation of Land Act. All of them contain cooling off rights. Our focus, of course, will be on the provisions of the NCA, Section 121, read with Regulation 57. Hi, are you still awake? I hope so. Let's look when the cooling off right is available. The NCA limits the cooling off right to installment sale agreement and leases entered into at any other location than the credit provider's registered business premises. Take note, there is a serious restriction on the cooling off right as far as the cooling off right is concerned, as far as its application is concerned. The right is only available in the case of an installment sale or lease. A Section 8 for if other agreement, for instance, cannot be rescinded. The same holds for money loans, mortgages, etc. In these cases, the ordinary rules of the law of contracts will apply. There is also a restriction pertaining to the place of entering into the installment sale or lease. Only where the agreement was entered into at any other place than the credit provider's registered place of business, the consumer will be entitled to cool off. The opposite is also true. Where the agreement was entered into at the credit provider's registered place of business, the right to rescind cannot be used by the consumer. What constitutes the credit provider's registered business premises is a factual question. The court must decide. The term will probably include any formal structure or building used by the credit provider to conduct business from. For instance, any branch of a particular retailer. The bottom line is, if the agreement is concluded in the shop, for instance, the consumer cannot rescind the contract. But if the contract is concluded at the consumer's home or workplace, for instance, the consumer can rescind the agreement. What do you think is the underlying policy involved here? Let us now assume that jewelry, for instance, was sold to the consumer at a house party, arranged, arranged for that purpose in terms of an installment sale agreement. I hope you agree that the consumer can cool off or rescind the contract. When and how must the consumer cool off? The consumer may terminate the agreement within 5 business days, not days, not calendar days, business days after signing it. Here we encounter the next and serious restriction on the NCA's cooling off right. The consumer can only cool off within a period of 5 business days. After that, rescission is no longer possible and the consumer will be bound to the agreement. Business days are defined in Section 2 Sub 5 and only include work days. In other words, Saturdays, Sundays, and public holidays are not business days. If a number of business days have to be determined between the occurrence of 2 events, the LIFO principle applies. It means last day in, first day out. In other words, if the installment sale or lease is signed today, the first of the 5 business days is tomorrow. The fifth day, the last day, is included. We will do an example in class. Due to the fact that the NCA does not specifically require the agreement to be signed, the consumer has 5 business days from entering into the agreement within which to rescind it. Termination of the installment sale or lease by the consumer must be in writing and in terms of Regulation 57 be delivered by hand, fax, email, or registered mail to the credit provider's address specified in the agreement or the credit provider's registered address. What are the consequences of making use of this right? The installment sale or lease is cancelled and reciprocal restitution. Restitution from the credit provider to the consumer and from the consumer to the credit provider must take place. The credit provider may also claim the reasonable cost of having the goods returned to the credit provider, the costs of repairs and damage, and reasonable rent for the use of the goods from the consumer. The credit provider is also entitled to be compensated for the depreciation in value of the goods. When making use of the cooling off right, it is important to adhere strictly to the legislative provisions. If the latter are not strictly complied with, the consumer does not cool off effectively and will be bound to the agreement. So, for instance, if the consumer cools off orally instead of in writing, he does not cool off and will be bound to the agreement. Must the consumer be informed in the credit contract of his cooling off right? Yes, of course. You will remember that part of the compulsory content of credit agreements is to inform the consumer of her rights in terms of the Act. That includes the right to rescind the contract. Please read Standard Bank of South Africa versus Dlamini as indicated on the slide. The court take the protection afforded in terms of the NCA seriously and will, for instance, protect the interests of an illiterate consumer who is subject to the Act. We will have a look at the advantages and disadvantages of this right in class on Monday, 27 August. The next right we will discuss is early settlement by the consumer.